wind blowing. Echoing gunfire fades in the distance. It was December 30th, 2006. In a dimly lit room in Baghdad, the once most powerful man in Iraq stood trembling before a rope. The air was thick, almost motionless, as if time itself hesitated to move forward. Cameras rolled silently. A few men whispered prayers. And in those final moments, Saddam Hussein, the man who ruled a nation with iron and fear for nearly a quarter century, stared into the abyss of his own making. Chains clinking. The executioner's hands tightened the noose. The voice of a guard muttered the words of judgment. And then, silence. But before that final moment, before the chaos, before the world watched the fall of a dictator live on their screens, there was a beginning, one buried deep in the sands of Tikrit, wind howling across desert. Saddam Hussein Abdelmajid al-Tikriti was born on April 28, 1937, in a small village called Al-Auja, near Tikrit, north of Baghdad. His birth came into poverty, violence, and political chaos. His father died, or disappeared, before he was born. His mother, destitute and grief-stricken, tried to end her own life before giving birth. Saddam's earliest memories were not of warmth or comfort, but of fear, abandonment, and survival. He was raised by his uncle, Khairallah Talfa, a fervent nationalist who despised colonialism and spoke with venom about Western powers. From him, Saddam absorbed two things that would define his life: an obsession with Arab unity and a burning hatred of humiliation, crowd chanting faintly in the background. In the 1940s and 50s, Iraq was not yet free. The British still pulled the strings through their monarchy. Young Saddam grew up watching soldiers and politicians bow to foreign influence, and he vowed never to bow to anyone. At 20, he moved to Baghdad to join the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, a movement inspired by nationalism, socialism, and the dream of a united Arab world. There, Saddam found a cause and an identity. But identity came with violence. Gunfire erupts. In 1959, the Ba'ath Party attempted to assassinate Iraq's Prime Minister, Abd al-Karim Qasim. Saddam was among the young men chosen for the mission. Bullets flew in Baghdad's streets. Chaos, blood, and screams. The attempt failed and Saddam was shot in the leg. He fled to Syria, then Egypt, beginning his long life in exile. Those years in Cairo hardened him. He studied law, read about revolution, and watched Nasser's Egypt rise as a beacon of Arab pride. Saddam wanted Iraq to be that beacon, and himself, its Nasser. Soft music fades in. When the Ba'athists briefly took power in 1963, Saddam returned, only to see them fall again. But he waited, plotting, learning, building alliances. In July 1968, the Ba'ath Party struck again, this time, successfully. Through a bloodless coup, they seized Baghdad. At first, the new regime looked like a partnership. Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr was the president. Saddam, his ambitious cousin, quietly became vice president. But behind the scenes, Saddam was already reshaping Iraq in his own image. Doors creaking open, echo of a grand hall. He created secret police units. He took control of the intelligence services. He watched, listened, and recorded everything. Loyalty was rewarded. Dissent was erased. Saddam's method was simple: absolute control through fear and loyalty. He modernized the economy, built schools, hospitals, and roads. Oil revenues began to pour in. Iraq looked strong, stable, and rising. To the outside world, Saddam was a modernizer, a nationalist leader standing against imperialism. But inside, shadows grew darker, footsteps echoing down corridors. He watched his comrades, even his family, for signs of disloyalty, and when he found them, or imagined them, he struck. By 1979, Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr was old and frail. Saddam saw his moment. In July that year, he forced al-Bakr to resign, claiming it was for health reasons. Saddam Hussein became president of Iraq. The next week, he called a meeting of Ba'ath Party leaders, one that would become infamous. Crowd murmuring inside a vast conference hall, hundreds of officials sat nervously. Cameras rolled. Saddam took the podium and began reading a list of names. men accused of plotting against him. As each name was called, guards dragged the accused out. The audience sat frozen, hearing gunshots in the distance as their comrades were executed. By the end of that day, Saddam had purged the party and cemented his rule through fear. Silence, then faint sound of a heartbeat. It was the birth of the Republic of Fear. But Saddam didn't see himself as a tyrant. He saw himself as the guardian of Iraq, chosen by destiny, forged by hardship. He wanted to make Iraq a regional superpower, a rival to Iran and Saudi Arabia, a voice for Arab pride. He would build palaces, monuments, and weapons, and a cult of personality unlike anything the Middle East had ever seen. His face on every wall, his speeches broadcast into every home, his name woven into the very identity of Iraq. And yet, as his power grew, so did the shadows. Thunder rumbling. Across the border, in 1979, Iran had erupted in revolution. The Shah was gone. Ayatollah Khomeini had risen. A new Islamic republic now stood next to Saddam's secular Ba'athist Iraq, and Khomeini called for Saddam's overthrow. Saddam saw it as both a threat and an opportunity. He believed Iran was weak, fractured by revolution, and that he could strike quickly, take territory, and cement himself as the new Arab hero. He was wrong. In September 1980, Iraqi forces crossed the border. The Iran-Iraq War had begun, one of the longest, bloodiest wars of the 20th century. Explosions in the distance, trenches filled with mud and bodies, cities turned to rubble, gas attacks, missile strikes, and endless death. For 8 years, both nations bled each other dry. Hundreds of thousands perished, and yet Saddam held on, declaring victory even in stalemate, claiming divine endurance as proof of his destiny. But beneath the triumphs and parades, Iraq was drowning in debt, its people exhausted, its leader paranoid. The illusion of power had begun to crack, wind whistling through empty streets. And as the guns of the Iran-Iraq War fell silent in 1988, Saddam's gaze turned south, toward a small, oil-rich neighbor that once helped fund his war. Kuwait. Low, ominous music builds. The stage was set for his greatest gamble and his greatest fall. Fade to black. Low rumble of distant thunder. By the summer of 1990, Iraq stood battered but defiant. 8 years of war with Iran had drained its treasury, crippled its economy, and left 1 million casualties in its wake. Yet in Baghdad, Saddam Hussein still walked as if invincible, a man who believed he had stared death in the face and won. Echo of marching footsteps. The streets were lined with murals of his victories, songs praising his courage, and speeches broadcast daily declaring Iraq the fortress of Arab dignity. But beneath that pride, Iraq was collapsing under debt. Nearly $80 billion owed to countries that had once called Saddam a friend. One of those friends was Kuwait. Wind blows across desert dunes. Kuwait, a small desert kingdom on Iraq's southern border, had quietly financed Saddam Husein's war against Iran. Billions of dollars in loans, oil shipments, and support. But now that the war was over, Saddam demanded relief. He insisted Kuwait forgive the debt, arguing that Iraq's sacrifices had saved the Arab world from Iranian expansion. Kuwait refused. Worse still, Kuwaiti oil production began to rise sharply, flooding the market and driving prices down, choking Iraq's already dying economy. To Saddam, this wasn't just economic betrayal, it was humiliation. He accused Kuwait of stealing Iraq's oil through slant drilling along the Rumaila oil field. The tension grew. Behind closed doors, Saddam's pride turned into rage, crowd murmuring in background. At an Arab summit in late July 1990, he warned his neighbors that Iraq would not tolerate conspiracies or economic warfare. Most dismissed it as rhetoric. But on August 2, 1990, before dawn broke, Iraqi tanks rolled across the Kuwaiti border, explosions, engines roaring. Within hours, Kuwait City fell. The world woke up to a stunning reality. Saddam Hussein had invaded a sovereign Arab nation. To his people, he announced it as a liberation, calling Kuwait the 19th province of Iraq. Crowds were bussed to public squares, chanting his name as his soldiers paraded through the streets. But beyond Iraq's borders, the reaction was swift and furious. News bulletins overlapping faintly. The United Nations condemned the invasion. The Arab League was divided. And in Washington, President George H.W. Bush vowed that Saddam's aggression would not stand. Within weeks, an international coalition began to form. Dozens of nations united under one purpose: to drive Saddam out of Kuwait. Yet Saddam remained defiant. Cigarette being lit, silence follows. He believed no one would dare attack him. He underestimated the speed, scale, and determination of the coalition forming against him. By January 1991, Operation Desert Storm began. Jet engines scream overhead. The skies above Baghdad erupted in fire. Cruise missiles streaked through the night. Sirens wailed. For 42 days, coalition aircraft unleashed one of the most intense bombing campaigns in history. Bridges, power plants, communication centers, all shattered. Yet amid the devastation, Saddam appeared on television, smiling in military uniform, proclaiming Iraq's steadfastness and divine protection. In a calculated move, he launched Scud missiles into Israel and Saudi Arabia, hoping to fracture the coalition by provoking Arab nations to withdraw. But it failed. On February 24th, the ground war began. In just 100 hours, coalition forces crushed the Iraqi military. Entire divisions surrendered or fled. The mother of all battles, as Saddam had called it, became one of the most lopsided defeats in modern warfare. Footsteps crunching in sand. As Iraqi forces retreated from Kuwait, they set hundreds of oil wells ablaze. Black smoke swallowed the skies. Day turned to night. The fires burned for months, painting the Gulf in apocalyptic red. Saddam's army was shattered. Tens of thousands were dead. His dream of leading the Arab world lay in ashes. But still, he survived. Wind howling through broken buildings. When coalition forces stopped short of entering Baghdad, Saddam remained in power. To many it was a mystery, a calculated political restraint. To Saddam it was a sign that destiny still protected him. In the months that followed, uprisings erupted across Iraq. Shia rebels in the south, Kurds in the north, inspired by his defeat, rose up, demanding freedom. But Saddam unleashed his fury. Helicopters overhead, faint gunfire. The Republican Guard, his elite troops, crushed the rebellions with brutal efficiency. Villages burned. Thousands disappeared. The marshes of southern Iraq turned red with blood. And yet, even in defeat, Saddam reasserted his control. He rebuilt his secret police. He purged any officer suspected of disloyalty. And he turned the sanctions imposed by the United Nations into propaganda, blaming the West for the suffering of his people. Crowd chanting, "With our blood, with our soul, we sacrifice for Saddam." Through hardship, he crafted a new myth. Saddam, the eternal defender of Iraq, the man who stood alone against the world. But outside his borders, the world tightened the noose. Sanctions devastated Iraq's economy. Medicine, food, and supplies grew scarce. The once modern nation began to decay. Hospitals ran without electricity. Children starved. And yet Saddam continued to build palaces, over 80 across the country, gilded symbols of grandeur amid poverty, soft echo of footsteps in Marble Hall. To his mind, these palaces were monuments of defiance, proof that Iraq's leader had not been broken. But inside those marble walls, the isolation grew. The same man who once commanded armies now trusted almost no one. His sons Uday and Qusay became his enforcers. Violent, unpredictable, feared even by his generals. He surrounded himself with loyalists and sycophants. The truth could no longer reach him. And as the 1990s unfolded, Saddam's defiance would once again set him on a collision course with the world. Static hum of an old television broadcast. The United Nations demanded proof of Iraq's disarmament. the destruction of chemical and biological weapons programs he once used during the war. But Saddam stalled, manipulated, and played a dangerous game of cat and mouse with inspectors. He feared transparency would reveal weakness. To the world, it looked like deceit. And to Washington, it looked like a threat that could not be ignored forever. Wind rising, distant rumble of storm. By the turn of the millennium, whispers of regime change began to echo once more. In palaces of marble and gold, Saddam Hussein still believed himself untouchable. But far beyond the Tigris, plans were already being written that would bring his empire, and his illusion of power, crashing down. Ominous silence. Low hum of static, distant thunder rolling over Baghdad. By the late 1990s, Iraq had become a nation trapped between two realities, the illusion of strength and the weight of despair. Inside Baghdad, propaganda still painted the picture of a proud nation defying the world. Saddam's image adorned every wall, every billboard, every classroom. But outside the capital, the truth was harder to hide. Wind howling through cracked buildings. The sanctions imposed after the Gulf War had left deep scars. The once vibrant economy had crumbled. Hospitals lacked basic medicine. Electricity flickered on and off. Food was rationed. And the people, once proud, once resilient, began to whisper in fear and frustration. Saddam's security apparatus listened to those whispers. The Mukhabarat, Iraq's feared intelligence service, ensured that even private despair could become a death sentence. Fear became oxygen. Silence became survival. Yet Saddam remained unbending. He framed the suffering as sacrifice, the cost of resistance against Western domination. His speeches were defiant, his tone unwavering. "We will eat grass," he once said, "but we will not bow." Crowd chanting, "With our blood, with our soul." To many Iraqis, he had become more than a ruler. He was the embodiment of endurance, even if that endurance came through pain. But to the world, Saddam Hussein had become a dangerous enigma. Throughout the 1990s, United Nations weapons inspectors searched Iraq for evidence of chemical, biological, and nuclear programs. What they found, and what they didn't, became the center of a global debate. Saddam had once built one of the most advanced weapons programs in the Middle East. During the 1980s, his regime used chemical weapons against Iran and even against his own Kurdish population in Halabja, where clouds of mustard gas killed thousands in minutes. The memory of that atrocity haunted the international community. Soft gust of wind. So when Saddam began obstructing inspections, expelling inspectors, and playing diplomatic games, suspicion turned to certainty in the eyes of the West. In 1998, UN inspectors were forced to leave Iraq after repeated confrontations. The United States and the United Kingdom responded with airstrikes, Operation Desert Fox. Air raid sirens blaring. For 4 nights, Baghdad was bombed once again. Precision missiles struck military sites and government buildings. When the smoke cleared, Saddam remained, alive, defiant, and furious. He claimed victory, accusing the West of hypocrisy, calling the attacks proof that Iraq's independence was feared, not condemned. But behind closed doors, paranoia deepened. He rotated his bodyguards constantly. He slept in different palaces each night. Even his inner circle was never sure where he truly was. The dictator who once trusted no one now trusted even less. And yet, he continued to rule through ritual and spectacle. Echo of marching bands, military parade sounds. Every year he held massive parades through Baghdad, lines of soldiers, tanks, and missiles rolling under his gaze. He stood on balconies waving to cheering crowds. To the world, it was a display of power. To those who watched closely, it was a performance, the last act of a man surrounded by ghosts. By the early 2000s, the world around Saddam was changing, news static. The attacks of September 11, 2001, sent shockwaves across the globe. And in the United States, a new administration came to power, one determined to reshape the Middle East. Suddenly, Iraq, once contained, once isolated, was back at the center of the world's attention. American leaders began to speak of weapons of mass destruction, of hidden stockpiles, and secret programs. Old intelligence reports were revived. New suspicions grew, and Saddam, through his own arrogance and fear, played directly into their hands. When the United Nations offered him one last chance for cooperation, he allowed inspectors to return, but he obstructed, delayed, and denied. To him, the appearance of defiance was power. To his enemies, it was justification. Low ticking sound, like a clock counting down. By early 2003, the world stood on the brink of war. Saddam believed the United States would never invade. He thought they would bomb, threaten, posture, but never risk another full-scale conflict in the Middle East. He underestimated how much had changed since 1991. In March 2003, the sky over Baghdad once again filled with fire. Explosions echo across the horizon. Operation Iraqi Freedom had begun. Cruise missiles rained down on government buildings, command centers, and military bases. The shock and awe campaign turned night into day. From his bunker, Saddam addressed the nation on television, calm, defiant, dressed in uniform. "Our enemies will drown in their own blood," he declared. But the tide of history was already turning against him. Within days, coalition forces pushed deep into Iraqi territory. The Republican Guard collapsed. Cities fell one after another: Basra, Karbala, Najaf. By early April, American tanks were rolling toward Baghdad. Still, Saddam clung to his illusion of control. He appeared briefly in public, shaking hands, firing a rifle into the air, promising victory. Yet even then his generals were fleeing, his soldiers surrendering, his government crumbling, airplanes roaring overhead, distant gunfire. On April 9, 2003, the world watched live as a massive statue of Saddam Hussein was pulled down in Firdos Square. The image of the dictator, once omnipresent, crashed to the ground under the boots of cheering Iraqis and foreign soldiers. For the first time in 3 decades, Baghdad was without him. But Saddam himself had vanished. Soft, eerie silence. Intelligence agencies across the world began the largest manhunt in modern history. Rumors spread he was in Tikrit, in Syria, in a desert bunker. Each day, the legend grew. The man who once ruled millions had become a ghost in his own land. For 8 months he eluded capture. He moved between safe houses, sometimes disguised, sometimes hiding in plain sight. His once grand palaces stood empty, looted, burned. His loyalists, scattered. His sons, Uday and Qusay, were hunted down and killed in Mosul that July. And yet Saddam endured, silent, watching, waiting, until December 13, 2003. Wind blowing over dry fields. In a small farmhouse near his birthplace, American soldiers uncovered a narrow hole in the ground, barely wide enough for one man. Inside, covered in dirt, exhausted, and unarmed, was Saddam Hussein. The man who once commanded armies and ruled a nation with absolute power was pulled from a hiding place no larger than a coffin. Flash of camera shutters, muffled voices shouting. As soldiers dragged him out, disheveled and defeated, one of them said softly, "We got him." Those 3 words echoed across the world. And in that moment, the illusion of invincibility shattered forever. But his capture was not the end of his story, only the beginning of his reckoning. Fade to black, slow heartbeat fades, distant hum of wind over desert ruins. When American forces announced Saddam Hussein's capture in December 2003, the world exhaled a breath it had held for decades. The symbol of fear, war, and defiance was finally in chains. Yet, for the people of Iraq, the capture marked not the end of their suffering, but the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter. Shutter clicks, reporters shouting faintly. In those first days, images of Saddam flooded global screens. The once mighty leader being examined by military doctors, his hair unkempt, his beard gray, his eyes hollow. He looked nothing like the statues that once towered over Baghdad. The world saw, for the first time, a man stripped of myth. Still, to some Iraqis, he remained a figure of power, a symbol of what once was, for better or worse. To others, he was a ghost of their trauma, a reminder of the years spent under terror. Saddam was taken to a secret location near Baghdad, later known as Camp Cropper, where he would spend the remaining years of his life. The U.S. called him a prisoner of war. They fed him, allowed him to write, to read the Quran. Yet isolation became his new battlefield. Metal door closing, echoing footsteps. Interrogators came in waves. They questioned him about weapons programs, about al-Qaeda connections, about his decisions to invade Iran and Kuwait. Saddam denied everything, calmly, coldly. He said, "I am still the president of Iraq." But outside his cell, Iraq itself was falling apart. With his regime gone, the delicate balance he had ruled through fear collapsed overnight. Explosions in distance, crowd shouting. Sectarian violence erupted, Sunni against Shia, militias against militias. The U.S. occupation, meant to bring stability, became a magnet for insurgency. Cities that once bowed to Saddam's iron rule turned into battlefields. Car bombs replaced speeches. The unity he had forced through terror disintegrated into chaos. For years, Saddam had claimed that only he could hold Iraq together. And now, as blood filled the streets, that prophecy seemed hauntingly close to truth. Meanwhile, his trial began. Cameras clicking, murmurs in a courtroom. In 2004, the Iraqi Special Tribunal charged Saddam Hussein with crimes against humanity, primarily for the 1982 Dujjail massacre, where 148 villagers were executed after a failed assassination attempt against him. When he first entered the courtroom, he walked tall, defiant, chin high, wearing a dark suit and clutching the Quran. Reporters noted that he looked less like a man on trial and more like a man commanding one. He refused to recognize the court's legitimacy, calling it the theater of the occupiers. But the evidence was overwhelming. Documents, eyewitnesses, mass graves, years of terror laid bare before the world. Soft whispers, gavel strikes. As the months passed, Saddam's arrogance wavered between performance and fatigue. He lectured judges, argued with witnesses, even joked with guards. Yet when he spoke of Iraq, of his version of Iraq, his voice softened. It was the voice of a man who believed until the end that history would vindicate him. Outside, the world was changing faster than the courtroom could keep up. Gunfire, helicopter rotors overhead. Insurgents attacked daily. Suicide bombings became routine. Iraq's new leaders struggled to maintain order. The dream of a peaceful, democratic Iraq faded beneath the rubble. And as the nation bled, Saddam's trial dragged on. Each session televised, each verdict debated in whispers and shouts. On November 5, 2006, the verdict was delivered. Heartbeat slow, faint gasp from crowd. Guilty. The sentence, death by hanging. In that instant, the courtroom erupted. Some cheered, others wept. Saddam stood still, staring at the judge. Then he smiled faintly, not of joy, not of fear, but of pride. He raised the Quran and shouted, "Long live Iraq, long live the people," before guards led him away. From that moment, every second of his life was numbered. Clock ticking softly. In the weeks that followed, international appeals and protests erupted. Some argued that his execution would ignite further violence. Others saw it as long overdue justice. But history, it seemed, had already made its decision. On December 30, 2006, the morning of Eid al-Adha, Saddam Hussein was led from his cell. Dressed in black, Quran in hand, he greeted his guards calmly. His last request was simple: to die as a soldier, not as a criminal. The request was denied. Metal doors opening slowly. He was taken to a small chamber in Baghdad, the same city where his voice once thundered from loudspeakers, now echoing only through whispers. Witnesses gathered. The air was cold, still, heavy with the weight of history. A camera was set to record. Saddam looked at his executioners, men from the same country he once ruled, and asked, "Do you know what you are doing?" They did not answer. Chains clinking, quiet murmurs. Moments before the trapdoor opened, Saddam began reciting the Shahada, the Muslim declaration of faith. His voice was steady. Then, the floor dropped. Brief silence, then a dull thud. The dictator was gone. For the first time in 35 years, Iraq no longer had Saddam Hussein. But his death did not bring peace. Explosions in distance, children crying. The country continued to unravel: civil war, terrorism, foreign occupation. The vacuum he left behind swallowed the hopes of millions. His execution marked not a conclusion, but a fracture, one that would shape the Middle East for decades to come. And in that chaos, a haunting question began to emerge. Had Iraq lost a tyrant, or the only man who could control its fury? Soft wind through empty streets. In death, Saddam became both a lesson and a ghost, a symbol of how power corrupts, how fear sustains, and how history is never as simple as good or evil. Yet the full truth of Saddam Hussein, the man, the myth, the shadow, was still not complete. Because even as the rope tightened around his neck, his legacy was just beginning to echo across generations. Slow fade to black, faint recitation of prayer in background, soft wind over desert ruins, distant call to prayer. When the rope went still and the echo of the trapdoor faded, a chapter of modern history closed. And yet, nothing felt resolved. Saddam Hussein was dead, but the Iraq he left behind was unrecognizable, its wounds deeper than ever before. Slow footsteps through rubble. In the days that followed, his body was taken to his hometown, Al-Auja, near Tikrit, the same soil that once birthed his dreams of power. Mourners gathered in secret, defying bans and curfews, whispering prayers for the man they called Rais, the president. To them, he was a fallen lion. To others, a tyrant finally silenced. The divide was absolute. As his coffin was lowered into the earth, Iraq's streets burned once again. Car bombs, gunfire, revenge killings, sectarian hatred, once held in check by terror, now ruled unchecked. The very fear Saddam had used to control Iraq had been replaced by chaos, and in that chaos, his ghost lingered. Children shouting, distant explosion. The U.S. occupation dragged on, facing insurgency and instability. Militias carved up neighborhoods. The Green Zone in Baghdad became a symbol of a fractured nation, guarded walls dividing rulers and the ruled. The dream of democracy, promised by war, was fading into disillusionment. And as the years passed, new forces began to rise from the ashes of Saddam's Iraq. Extremist groups filled the void, radicalized, vengeful, fueled by the very anger that decades of dictatorship and foreign intervention had sown. By 2014, a group calling itself the Islamic State, ISIS, declared a caliphate on Iraqi soil. Their black flags flew over cities once ruled by Saddam's iron hand. The same streets, the same people, trapped again in a nightmare of violence, somber orchestral swell. It was a cruel irony that in destroying the dictator, the world had unleashed the demons his regime once contained. But beyond the blood and the politics, another question endured. Who was Saddam Hussein truly? To some, he was the last Arab nationalist, a man who stood against Western hegemony, who defied superpowers, who dreamed of restoring pride to a fractured region. To others, he was a monster, a man who murdered his own citizens, invaded neighbors, and drowned a nation in fear. Perhaps he was both, a reflection of the century that shaped him. Wind rustling through date palms. He rose from nothing, a poor boy from Tikrit, and built an empire of sand and blood. He believed he was destined to rule, to restore Iraq's greatness, to challenge the world. And for a time he did. But power, once absolute, became isolation. Fear became his fortress. And in the end, that fortress collapsed from within. The illusion of invincibility, gone. The man who once commanded millions, buried in silence. Yet his story still echoes. Every nation that watched him rise and fall learned something about the nature of authority, about the cost of ambition, about the dangerous comfort of fear. Soft piano begins under narration. For history is not written only by the victors. It is also whispered by those who remember, by those who lived in the shadows of power, by those who saw what it truly costs to build an empire on fear. And perhaps, somewhere deep in the deserts of Iraq, where the wind carries the dust of centuries, the spirit of that boy from Tikrit still lingers, not as a ruler, not as a monster, but as a reminder that power is an illusion, that fear is temporary, and that every man who builds his throne on control will one day face the silence of his own creation. Silence. Faint call to prayer returns, fading into distance.